Beverly Crane had let herself into my cabin 3 times before I'd ever thought to change the locks. The first 2 times she'd left violation notices on the kitchen table like she owned the place, which she very much did not. The third time, she walked in on a Saturday afternoon in October and found me sitting across from the Attorney General of the state of Tennessee, who was in the middle of telling me something about the legal definition of criminal trespass. Beverly's hand was still on the door handle. The Attorney General set down her wine glass very slowly, and I watched Beverly's face go through 5 distinct expressions in about 4 seconds, none of them good. My name is Thomas Callahan. Most people call me Tom. I'm 58 years old. I run a small construction consulting firm out of Knoxville, and I have owned a cabin on Watauga Lake in Carter County, Tennessee, for 22 years. Owned is the right word, though steward is more accurate, because the cabin itself was built by my father in 1978, the year I turned 12, and some things belong to you in ways that predate the deed. My father's name was Robert Callahan. He was a Finnish carpenter by trade, the kind of craftsman who could look at a piece of raw lumber and see what it was going to become before he'd touched it with a tool. He spent 3 summers building that cabin on a 6-acre parcel he'd bought for $8,400 in 1975, back when lakefront property on Watauga was still in the range of what a working man could afford if he was disciplined about saving. He poured the foundation himself. He framed the walls himself. He installed the tongue-and-groove pine ceiling in the main room himself, fitting each board with the precision he brought to everything. When I was 12 and 13 and 14, I handed him tools and held boards in place and learned that the gap between doing something and doing something right is where character lives. My father passed in 2001 and left the cabin to me in a will that was 3 pages long and entirely unambiguous. I've paid the property taxes, maintained the structure, replaced the roof in 2009, rebuilt the dock in 2014, and spent every significant vacation of my adult life on that lake. My daughter Emma got engaged on that dock. My son Patrick learned to fish from it. My wife Carol read through an entire shelf of novels on the screened porch over 7 summers before she passed in 2017, and I have never been to that cabin without feeling her there in the particular quality of light off the water in the late afternoon. The Watauga Lake Property Owners Association had existed since the early 1980s, when development around the lake started filling in and residents decided some shared coordination made sense. For most of its history, it had been exactly that: coordination, maintenance of the shared boat ramp, upkeep of the common gravel road serving 6 cabin properties including mine, occasional social events in summer. Annual dues were $1,200, and you got what you paid for, which was functional infrastructure and no drama. Beverly Crane became president 4 years before the October afternoon I'm describing. She'd moved to the lake full-time in 2018 after retiring from 20 years as a residential real estate agent in Johnson City. She was 63, tall and angular, with the particular bearing of someone who had spent 2 decades convincing people their instincts about property value were wrong and hers were right. She drove a 2022 Cadillac Escalade in Summit White and ran the association with the focused energy of someone who had recently discovered that a small domain was better than no domain at all. I don't want to make Beverly a cartoon. She genuinely believed property values around Watauga Lake were being undermined by a lack of consistent standards, and she genuinely believed she was the right person to enforce those standards. The problem was that her definition of standards expanded continuously, her interpretation of the association's authority expanded with it, and the gap between what the CCARs actually said and what Beverly decided they meant grew wider every year she held the position. The first violation notice appeared on my kitchen table in June of her 2nd year as president, left during a period when I was in Knoxville and the cabin was unoccupied. Beverly apparently had a key that a previous association president had provided for emergency access years earlier, a key I hadn't known existed until I found a notice citing my dock configuration as non-compliant with new aesthetic guidelines the board had adopted at a February meeting I hadn't attended because I hadn't known it was happening. The notice required me to repaint the dock railings from natural cedar to a specific brown designated in a color chart attached. I repainted them. Not because the requirement was reasonable, but because I had other things to spend my energy on and a fresh coat of paint wasn't worth a fight. The second notice, same method of delivery, appeared in August of the same year. My cabin's exterior trim color, which had been the same deep green my father had painted it in 1989, was now inconsistent with community aesthetic standards adopted at a March meeting I also hadn't received notice of. I wrote back requesting a copy of the standards document and asking how meetings were being noticed to members. The response confirmed that meetings were noticed only by posting on the bulletin board at the boat ramp, which meant Beverly, as a full-time resident who checked the bulletin board daily, had effective control over what got decided at meetings that part-time owners, 45 minutes away, never knew were happening. I noted this in a letter. Beverly noted back that the process was consistent with the association's bylaws. She was technically right, and she knew exactly what that meant in practice. The third notice arrived in September and was the one that changed the nature of things. Beverly delivered it to me personally at the door with the expression of someone doing something unpleasant but necessary. The notice alleged that a 4th of July gathering I'd hosted, 16 family members using the cabin and dock, constituted commercial use of a residential property under the association's activity guidelines, subject to a $500 fine per day of occurrence. Total fine, $1,500. I read it twice, while Beverly waited on the porch. "You're fining me for having my family here," I said. The guidelines define gatherings over 12 non-resident individuals as commercial activity. That guideline was written for short-term rental operations. It says so in the preamble. She smiled the way people smile when they've decided the conversation is over. "You're welcome to appeal to the board, Tom." She left. I spent that evening reading the CCRs, the bylaws, and every piece of correspondence I'd had with Beverly over the previous 14 months. Then I started looking at structural questions. I'm a construction consultant. My job for 30 years has been to look at plans, look at what's actually built, and identify the gap between the two. It's a habit that transfers easily to property documents. I drove to the Carter County Register of Deeds office in Elizabethton on a Monday morning, a 40-minute drive from the cabin. The clerk, a woman named Patrice, who knew the filing system the way some people know their own kitchens, pulled records on my parcel and the surrounding parcels back to original conveyance without comment. I was there for 4 hours. What I found by the end of those 4 hours was something I hadn't been looking for. The original 1975 deed for my father's parcel included a metes and bounds description that placed the eastern property line approximately 14 feet further into what was now the common area dock structure than the current association survey showed. The discrepancy was small enough to be invisible at normal scale and had apparently gone unnoticed through multiple ownership transfers and surveys over the decades. But it was there, precisely described in the original deed language, and it meant that a portion of the shared dock infrastructure that the association had been maintaining and charging members for was built, in part on land that belonged to me. I photographed every document, made full copies at a copy shop in Elizabethton, and drove back to the cabin without calling anyone. I cooked dinner and sat on the porch and watched the light go off the water and thought about what my father would have said. He would have said, "Measure it again before you tell anybody." So I did. David Park was a real estate attorney in Knoxville, 41 years old, precise and unhurried in the way I value in anyone I work with. He'd done the title work when I refinanced the cabin in 2015. I spread everything on his conference table on a Thursday afternoon and watched him go through it with the focused quiet of someone doing actual work. After 30 minutes, he looked up. "You need an independent licensed survey of your parcel against the original deed description," he said. "This discrepancy, if the boundary is what it looks like, predates the current association structure by decades." Jim Blevins was 66 years old, licensed in Tennessee since 1984, and knew Watauga Lake property as well as anyone in the region. He spent 6 hours on my property and the adjacent common area on a cool October morning. His preliminary findings confirmed it. The eastern boundary of my parcel extended 13.7 feet beyond what the association's 2007 survey showed. The structural footings of the main dock platform, sunk in 2006 when the association rebuilt the shared dock, were within my property boundary. The association had been collecting dock maintenance fees from all 32 members, including me, to maintain infrastructure partially built on land belonging to me. No easement had ever been recorded. The dock, built in 2006, had been constructed on private property without the owner's knowledge. $1,800 per year from 32 properties for 15 years. David asked how I wanted to proceed. I told him I needed the full picture first. The full picture got more complicated the following week when Ray Tipton knocked on my door with a manila envelope. Ray was 71, a retired civil engineer from Bristol who'd owned the cabin, 2 properties north of mine, since 1991. He was deliberate in the way of men who've spent careers thinking before speaking, and he'd watched Beverly's tenure with increasing discomfort he'd expressed to me in fragments over 2 years, without quite arriving at a specific complaint. He'd decided he was done being quiet. Inside the envelope were copies of 3 contracts between the association and a company called Crane Property Services. Landscaping and grounds maintenance for common areas, fees totaling $28,400 over 3 years. Ray had gotten them through a public records request after noticing the company name on an invoice at the boat ramp. Crane Property Services was owned by Gerald Crane, Beverly's husband. I read the contracts twice, then pulled out the association bylaws and went to the conflict of interest provisions. Section 8.4 was explicit. Board members and officers with a financial interest in any contract under consideration were required to disclose that interest and recuse themselves from the vote. Beverly had signed all 3 contracts as association president. The board meeting minutes Ray had also obtained showed no disclosure and no recusal. David Park looked at the contracts and the bylaws the following morning. Under Tennessee Nonprofit Corporation Law, TCA Section 4858302, a director with a conflicting interest must disclose and abstain, he said. The failure to do so renders the transaction voidable and exposes the officer to personal liability. Beverly signed these contracts. Gerald's company received the payments. No disclosure, no recusal. He set the documents down. This isn't just a civil matter anymore, depending on how it's characterized. This is something the State Attorney General's office would find interesting. I thought about that and almost smiled because Kate Brennan was coming to the cabin that Saturday. Kate and I had met at Vanderbilt in 1986, both stranded at a campus library during a thunderstorm with nothing to do but talk. We'd been friends for 38 years in the way some friendships become load-bearing, the kind where you don't talk for 3 months and pick up exactly where you left off. She'd become an attorney, then a prosecutor, then in 2018 had been appointed Attorney General of Tennessee, confirmed by the legislature, and had been running that office ever since with the combination of precision and stubbornness that had characterized her since the library thunderstorm. She called these visits working vacations. What they actually were was 2 days of sitting on my porch talking about everything except work, which neither of us was very good at maintaining. On the Friday before Kate arrived, I sent Beverly Crane a letter. David had drafted it. The letter was formally titled Notice of Revocation of Access and stated that the association and its officers, agents, and representatives were hereby notified that permission to access the property at my address was revoked, effective immediately, that any entry without explicit written permission or a valid legal order would constitute criminal trespass under Tennessee Code Annotated Section 39-14405, and that the revocation superseded any prior informal access arrangements, including any key held by current or former association officers. I sent it certified mail on Friday morning and slid a copy under Beverly's cabin door because I wanted to be certain she had it before the weekend. Kate arrived Saturday at noon in a rented Jeep Grand Cherokee with 2 bottles of Pinot Noir and a hardback novel she was already halfway through. We ate lunch on the porch. The October air was the particular crisp of Tennessee mountain autumn, the ridgeline across the lake showing orange and red and gold. The water was flat and dark blue, and a pair of herons was working the shallows near the old willow at the north end of my property. About an hour into an easy conversation ranging from her daughter's apartment to my son's new job, Kate set down her wine glass and said, almost as an aside, "There's an interesting Tennessee case from 2019 on the definition of criminal trespass in the context of HOA officers who claim implied authority." The court was fairly clear that no authority exists absent explicit written permission, regardless of prior informal practice. I looked at her. Why are you telling me this? Because you've mentioned Beverly Crane 4 times since I arrived, and you think you're being subtle. She picked up her wine. Tell me what's happening. So I told her. The whole thing, from the first violation notice to the dock fee dispute, to David Park's conference table, to Jim Blevins' sealed survey, to Ray Tipton's manila envelope with the Crane Property Services contracts. Kate listened without interrupting, the complete stillness of someone processing complex information in real time. When I finished, she was quiet. The AG's office has a consumer protection division that handles exactly this kind of nonprofit governance violation, she said. I'm saying that as your friend giving you information, not as the AG making an official statement, but you should know the channel exists and your documentation sounds comprehensive. That's useful to know, I said. She reached for her novel. Now can we please talk about something else for an hour before my brain refuses to stop being a lawyer? We were about 40 minutes into that hour, Kate reading, me watching the herons, both of us with fresh glasses of wine, when the front door opened and Beverly Crane walked in. She didn't knock. The door was unlocked because we were sitting 20 feet from it, and I hadn't thought to lock it against someone who'd received a formal revocation of access less than 24 hours earlier. Beverly walked 3 steps into the cabin holding a manila folder, talking before she'd looked up from it. Tom, I need to discuss this letter your attorney sent, because some of the language is frankly outrageous, and I think there's been a misunderstanding about the association's long-standing access arrange. She looked up. Kate Brennan was sitting in the armchair to my left, wine glass in hand, looking at Beverly with a particular neutral expression of someone who has spent decades managing their face in courtrooms. Beverly's hand was still on the door handle. The folder dropped about an inch in her grip. Her eyes went from Kate to me to Kate again, and I could see her doing what I'd done when I first found the plat map discrepancy, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she'd expected to see, finding that they didn't fit. Beverly, I said, keeping my voice even, you received my letter yesterday. She didn't look at me. She was still looking at Kate. I'm sorry, she said, in a register I hadn't heard from her before.
I didn't realize you had a guest. Catherine Brennan, Kate said. She set down her wine glass with the careful deliberateness of someone making a specific choice about the pace of the next few minutes. Tom and I go back a long way. The silence that followed was about 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time when nobody is speaking. I could see Beverly processing.
The last name paired with the particular quality of stillness Kate projected. The fact that Kate had offered no additional personal information and was watching Beverly with the attentive patience of someone waiting for a thing to develop, all of that was running through Beverly's calculation in real time. Are you, Beverly said, and stopped. Attorney General, Kate said, not unkindly, just the fact. Beverly looked at me for the first time since she'd seen Kate. Whatever she'd come to say about the letter, and the frankly outrageous language had reorganized itself somewhere between the door and where she was standing. I received a letter, she said finally. I came to discuss it. Beverly, I said, that letter revoked your access to this property. Your being here right now, after receiving that letter yesterday, is criminal trespass under Tennessee Code annotated section 39-14405. You walked into my home without permission. I kept my voice level because losing it would have been wrong, and because Kate was watching and I wasn't going to lose it in front of Kate Brennan. I need you to leave, and I need you to not come back without my written permission or a valid court order. She left. She backed out, still holding the manila folder without saying another word. The sound of her Escalade starting came through the still October air 20 seconds later. Kate and I sat in silence for a moment. Then she said, "How long has this been going on?" 4 years, I said. She picked up her wine. Send me the full documentation file on Monday. I called Carter County Sheriff's Department that evening and filed a report. The deputy who responded was Amanda Pruitt, late 30s, who listened with professional attention, confirmed that the revocation letter had been delivered and signed for the previous morning based on the certified mail tracking I showed her, and prepared a report with the letter and delivery confirmation attached as exhibits. She asked if Kate, as a witness, wanted to provide a statement. Kate said yes. Deputy Pruitt's expression remained professionally neutral throughout, though I noticed she wrote Kate's professional title in full on the witness statement form. The legal process that followed moved on 3 tracks simultaneously, the way these things tend to when the documentation is comprehensive and the legal framework is clear. The property boundary claim was the most straightforward. Jim Blevins's sealed survey, filed with the Carter County Register of Deeds, established the corrected boundary for a quiet title action. David filed in Carter County Circuit Court in November. The association's attorney, Phil Garrett, out of Elizabethton, reviewed the survey against the original 1975 deed and called David within a week to say he wasn't going to contest the boundary as drawn. There wasn't a credible argument to the contrary. The trespass report went to the Carter County District Attorney's Office. The D.A. Harlan Webb reviewed Deputy Pruitt's report, the revocation letter, and the delivery confirmation. He issued a citation for criminal trespass, a Class B misdemeanor in Tennessee, carrying up to 30 days incarceration and up to $500 in fines. Not a devastating criminal consequence in isolation, but a criminal record entry for someone who had spent 30 years in real estate, which carries its own weight. The conflict of interest investigation moved slowest and hit hardest. Kate's office had a consumer protection division that handled exactly the kind of nonprofit governance violations David had identified. The formal referral came from David in his capacity as my attorney, and Kate had appropriately recused herself from any supervisory role in the matter, documenting that recusal in writing the day after her cabin visit. The investigation was assigned to a staff attorney who proceeded without direction from Kate. 8 weeks of review covered 3 years of association financial records. The Crane Property Services contracts totaled 28,400 hours. 2 additional payments characterized as emergency maintenance expenditures. Payments that hadn't gone through formal contract process added another $11,600. Total payments to Beverly's husband's company over 3 years, $40,000. Total board disclosures of Beverly's conflict of interest, 0. Total board recusals by Beverly, 0. David filed civil claims in Carter County Circuit Court in December. Breach of fiduciary duty, unjust enrichment from fees collected for maintenance of property built on my land without permission, and violation of the Tennessee Consumer Protection Act under TCA 47-18-104, which allows for treble damages and attorney's fees. The total damages calculation in David's demand letter was $94,000 in direct and compensatory damages, with treble damages under the Consumer Protection Statute bringing maximum exposure to approximately $282,000 before attorney's fees. The association received the demand letter on January 15th. By January 22nd, Phil Garrett had called David to open settlement discussions. The negotiation wasn't triumphant in the way those scenes look in movies. It was 3 weeks of phone calls between attorneys, document exchanges, and the slow, grinding work of arriving at terms everyone could live with. Beverly's personal attorney made the expected arguments. The property boundary discrepancy had been an honest administrative error predating Beverly's tenure. The conflict of interest had been an oversight rather than intentional concealment. The trespass had been a misunderstanding born of long-standing informal practice. David's response to each was the same. The documentation didn't support them. The settlement was signed on February 8th. The association paid $78,000 covering the property boundary claim, the improperly collected dock maintenance fees going back 15 years, and compensatory damages. Beverly's personal settlement was $47,000, covered partly from her own assets and partly from a director's and officer's insurance policy the association carried. Total, $125,000. Beverly entered a no-contest plea on the criminal trespass citation on March 3rd in Carter County General Sessions Court. $500 fine, 1 year of unsupervised probation. Her attorney had argued for a diversion program that would have kept the matter off her record. The DA declined, given the existence of the formal revocation letter documenting that Beverly had been explicitly warned before entering the property. Beverly resigned from the association presidency on February 12th, 4 days after signing the civil settlement. Her resignation letter cited personal reasons and thanked the community for 4 years of service. Ray Tipton was elected interim president by acclamation. The first action of the reconstituted board was to commission an independent audit of association finances going back 5 years and to adopt a formal conflict of interest policy with specific disclosure requirements for all board members. The audit was completed in April and found no additional irregularities beyond what the egg investigation had already identified. I attended that emergency meeting, sat in a folding chair in the association's meeting room at the boat ramp, listening to votes and discussion, watching people who'd been quiet for 4 years find their voices now that the pressure had lifted. A woman named Linda Marsh, who owned the cabin directly south of mine and had never spoken to me beyond a wave, shook my hand afterward and said, "I should have said something 2 years ago." I told her I understood. It's easier to stay quiet when the cost of speaking seems higher than the cost of silence. The calculation changes when it doesn't. It's April now. I'm at the cabin for the first time since the settlement. The lake is up from winter rain. The herons are back at the North Shallows. The dock is exactly where it's always been, 7 feet of its landward section sitting on land my father bought for $8,400 in 1975. I've been sitting on this porch for an hour, coffee in hand, not doing much of anything, which is the specific luxury this place has always represented. Kate texted yesterday asking how the cabin was. I told her it was good. She said she might come back in the fall for the colors. I told her the door was open, which I can say now with different weight than it carried 6 months ago. I've thought a lot about what changed and what didn't. The cabin is the same. The lake is the same. The quality of light off the water at 7 in the morning is unchanged from what my father saw when he came here in 1978 with hand-drawn plans and a carload of tools. What changed is that what he built and left to me is documented now in ways it wasn't before. The boundary is surveyed and sealed. The easement will be recorded. The financial history is audited. The conflict of interest policy exists in writing. None of that makes the cabin more mine than it was before, but it makes the mineness harder to dispute. Beverly made a series of assumptions about what she could do and to whom and with what consequences. She assumed the informal key arrangement gave her ongoing authority. She assumed a revocation letter was a negotiating position rather than a legal fact. She assumed the person on the other end of 4 years of violation notices and fee disputes didn't have the documentation, the resources, or the connections to make a real problem for her. Every single one of those assumptions turned out to be wrong on a Saturday afternoon in October when she opened a door she had no legal right to open and found a woman she recognized sitting in the chair by the window. I don't hold the Kate element against her entirely. Kate being there was genuinely coincidental. What was not coincidental was that I'd been building a file for 4 years. The surveyor's sealed findings, the property boundary discrepancy, the 3 years of undisclosed conflict of interest contracts in a manila folder on my kitchen table. All of that existed long before Saturday afternoon. Kate accelerated things. But the documentation would have gotten there eventually. Ray Tipton came by last evening with a bottle of local Tennessee whiskey from a distillery in Johnson City that he brings around twice a year. We sat on this porch until the stars came out, he said after a while, in the way he says most things of substance. You know your father would have handled this exactly the same way. I asked what he meant. He would have measured it first, Ray said. Robert Callahan measured everything twice before he told anybody what he found. He sipped his whiskey. That's where you got it. I thought about that. About handing my father boards when I was 12 and holding them level while he worked, and the lesson in that being not about carpentry, but about the relationship between what you build and how carefully you build it. A structure measured right stands. A structure built on assumptions about what the measurements probably are falls eventually. The cabin has stood 46 years because my father measured the foundation before he poured it. What I built with the documentation and the survey and the conflict of interest evidence stood for the same reason. The most important thing my father left me wasn't the cabin. Though the cabin is irreplaceable, it wasn't the property or the deed or even the view from this porch. It was the habit of measuring, of reading the actual documents, of knowing where the lines are before someone tells you they're somewhere else. That habit saved what he built. And it's the thing I intend to carry forward, the same way he carried it and taught it to me in this very place. One board held level at a time. If you've got something worth keeping, something built by someone you loved, or built by your own hands over years of work, and someone with just enough authority is trying to tell you the lines are somewhere other than where they actually are, go find the original documents, read them yourself. The truth is usually in there, exactly where it was recorded, waiting for someone to look. Leave your story in the comments. I read everyone.